Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of Season 2 of Ethos English, the podcast for advanced English learners with a focus on vocabulary building, learning strategies, and critical thinking. I'm thrilled to be back. Let me start out by explaining the format as it's changed slightly from last season. At the end of each episode, I'll define or paraphrase all of the key vocabulary. When you consult the show notes at ethosenglish.com/podcast, you'll find links to all of the resources I mention, whether they be essays, videos, or other podcasts. You'll be prompted to sign up to my newsletter, and by doing so, you'll get a monthly review of the latest episodes with a link to a Quizlet flashcard study set to learn that month's vocabulary by heart. Today I'm recording bright and early. I tried to record this yesterday, but Barcelona on a Sunday afternoon is pretty noisy. Luckily, first thing in the morning, the only background noise is the birds. So let's get going before my neighbors wake up and start making a racket. So today I'll be talking about the zombies in our midst. And I was inspired to talk about this after reading about Paul Krugman, the 2008 Nobel Prize laureate for economics and New York Times columnist. And he came up with this idea, well, I don't know if he came up with it, but he's definitely popularized it, of what's called zombie ideas. That is, ideas that refuse to die despite overwhelming evidence to disprove them. And I find this idea very compelling because I think zombie ideas are everywhere, even in education. And today I'm going to talk about zombie ideas in economics in the news, and then I'm going to talk about a zombie idea in language learning, and more importantly, I'm going to provide you with an antidote to this zombie idea. Now, last month, the new British Prime Minister Liz Truss and her Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng. Chancellor of the Exchequer means finance minister. That's the term we would use in most other countries, but the UK has a special name for this post. It's the number 3 in the UK government after the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister. The Chancellor, for short, sets economic policy, including spending and taxation. So Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor, this new Chancellor under the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, last month announced these massive tax cuts that disproportionately benefit the most affluent members of society. And this announcement was a bit of a bombshell. It was a shock to a lot of people, and it had a negative impact on the UK's perceived creditworthiness in the international capital markets, and it's not had the effect they were hoping for. Mostly because the government simply doesn't have the money to pay for these tax cuts, and they have to borrow money from capital markets to finance these tax cuts. And as it turns out, international investors have been spooked by this move. If an investor is spooked, they're made nervous by something. And this is driving up the government's borrowing costs and actually undermining economic growth rather than boosting it. So this is a zombie idea, this idea of increasing growth by cutting taxes. This obsession with lowering taxes is a zombie idea according to Paul Krugman, not according to me. I'm just repeating what he said. And an example of a more egregious example of this package of cuts was the scrapping of bankers' bonuses. So until now, the UK had a cap, a limit on how much the bonuses that a banker could receive, at least tax-free. And so the UK is going to scrap these limits. They're going to get rid of them. And I'm not going to go into any further details about this story, except to point out that it's worth reading up on. And if you are interested in reading up on it, I would highly recommend the opinion piece for the Guardian newspaper that Gordon Brown wrote. Gordon Brown served as a member of Parliament, Chancellor of the Exchequer, like Kwasi Kwarteng, which, as I should point out, I kind of enjoyed reading about this. Kwasi Kwarteng has been nicknamed by some people in the media as Kamikaze Kwarteng because his plan is a bit suicidal, it would seem. Which sounds funny until you realize that he's going to be taking everyone else down with him too. So it's not like he's on his own in this suicide mission, unfortunately. So yeah, Gordon Brown was once upon a time in Kwasi Kwarteng's shoes. He was Chancellor as well as Prime Minister, all of this under the Labour Party. So I'm going to include the link to this opinion piece. I highly recommend reading it. And now, going back to Paul Krugman and this idea of zombie ideas. Well, he actually wrote a book specifically about zombie ideas in the realm of economics. And this book is called Arguing with Zombies: Economics, Politics, and the Fight for a Better Future. This was published back in 2020. Now, the key idea in Kwasi Kwarteng's budget, which is causing so much damage and is part of the bigger sort of, let's say, ideology that Paul Krugman is fighting against with everything he's got, is this concept of trickle-down economics. This is an interesting metaphor that was coined back in the 80s when neoliberalism, or I think it would be neoliberalism, was becoming incredibly popular around the world, especially in the US and the UK under Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. I should point out Thatcher was part of the Tory party, just as Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, the Tories, another name for the Conservatives, and Ronald Reagan, Republican. So, interestingly, as background, there's a really interesting article in The Atlantic about Paul Krugman, and if you read it, you'll find out, as I did, that Paul Krugman actually started out his career as a technocrat. That is, he perceived his role as an economist just to do the numbers and not have overtly political beliefs about the whole process of economics. And he was actually employed briefly in the White House when Ronald Reagan was in power in the 1980s. So he was right at the heart of the engine of trickle-down economics. I'm sorry for mixing metaphors here. An engine of trickle-down economics. And so just to explain briefly, trickle-down economics is the idea that additional wealth gained by the richest people in society, often through tax cuts, will have a good effect on the lives of everyone. And this is based on the assumption that the rich, the affluent, will put their extra money into businesses and investments. And this comes from the verb in English trickle, which means when a liquid flows slowly in drops or in a thin stream, like raindrops down a pane of glass, like a window on a rainy day. And the other day, a friend of mine, Anthony, who's also an English teacher, hello Anthony, hope you're listening, he pointed out, I thought it was quite interesting, that this metaphor, I don't know who came up with it, this trickle-down economics, because huge areas of the economy have been sort of engineered under different governments based around this principle. And he points out that it's actually a very sad metaphor, because when you think about it, first of all, like, when do things trickle? Well, when it's raining, and it's very slow. And if you look at a drop of water going down a pane of glass, it goes very slowly, and it doesn't go in straight lines. And his point was that as far as metaphors go, it's not very inspiring. And he contrasted this with a different idea. He said, what would be the opposite of trickle-down economics? And he wrote on Twitter, what about bubble-up economics? This idea of the opposite idea of wealth rising to the top from below and bubbling up. And I thought that was a beautiful image. I thought it was very clever, actually thinking about the metaphor more visually. We have to activate metaphors because sometimes they end up dying in our minds and we forget they're even metaphors. But anyway, I won't belabor this point. So zombie ideas, they're in the economy and they have real effects. This obsession with tax cuts is not supported by research, especially when countries don't have the money to finance them. And the idea is that, as the Atlantic article points out, Paul Krugman has become a strident critic, and he's become so critical of this new this obsession with what he sees as something that's not viable anymore. It hasn't worked, and it's caused real suffering. And he's strident. That is, he's incredibly critical to the point of annoying people. And the article is very interesting because it talks about how basically the author of the article suggests that he's mostly right, but that he doesn't actually reach his critics because he's so angry in his approach to criticizing them. And that reminded me of discussions I've had recently with people who I disagreed with, and how we really have to guard against being too self-righteous and getting too angry, because then we end up alienating the people we're trying to convince, or at least help see things from a different perspective. So if you ever struggle with talking to people you disagree with, this Atlantic article about Paul Krugman is interesting for that reason too. Now, today I want to talk about a zombie idea in the world of education, because zombie ideas are everywhere. They're not just in economics. And I find it, I challenge you to go out and try to find zombie ideas of your own, ideas that you think have outlived their usefulness out in the world. There are plenty of them. They're all over the place. And it's our idea to spot them and stab them through their unbeating heart. So, last week I spoke at a conference here in Barcelona called Innovate ELT, and it was about innovating in the area of language teaching in English. So I talked a lot about this idea of zombie ideas in English language teaching. And so what is this zombie idea, or one of them, because there are loads, too many to mention in one episode. But the one I'm going to be focusing on today that is important for you if you are wanting to improve your English. So I was talking about how there's a lot of evidence to show that a huge part of our language development is incidental. That is, it happens while we're using language, but not when we're explicitly studying it. And I read a book about this recently by Jeff Jordan. He's a writer in the ELT field, all about this, and how basically English teachers disregard the evidence that's right in front of them because we're so used to doing things in a certain way. And like Krugman, I'm kind of pissed off. And why? Why am I pissed off? Because so much of English language teaching still focuses on the explicit learning of grammar, which we know doesn't actually lead to increased fluency in the language. So basically, we're spending loads of hours every week in our classrooms and encouraging our students to go home and spend loads more hours doing more of what doesn't work, kind of like what the Tories are doing in the UK right now with the economy. And I was thinking that the fact that so many language teachers and their learners use these ineffective methods is a prime example of what we call the herd mentality. That is, people all doing the same thing, imitating what they see other people doing around them without questioning it. And so today I'm here to say, dare to be different. Dare I say, dare to be better or more effective, and devote more of your language learning efforts to getting input through reading and listening. So my idea is not complicated, it's not too academic, but it is supported by academic research that explicit study can be helpful, but if you aren't doing a fair amount of reading and listening in English, your English isn't improving at the rate it should be. But that's not to say that explicit study isn't helpful. It is. And I'm going to give you a tip today, which is about, rather than learning grammar, if you are going to study, I think it's really helpful to develop your ability, hone your ability to notice patterns in language that you otherwise wouldn't have picked up on. So think about studying not so much as something where you're absorbing information, but you're actually becoming more perceptive. You are better able to notice patterns because English, like any language, is full of patterns. And you can become better at noticing them. And so then as you're reading, as you're listening, you will naturally learn more from that input. So here's today's language learning strategy. Earlier, I mentioned how the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK sets economic policy. Now, the word set is one of a group of verbs like get, go, take, make, do, have, give, and put, all these really short common verbs in English that we call delexicalized verbs. We give them this name because on their own they often contain very little meaning, yet are the building blocks of the most common word combinations in English. That is what we call collocations. Because these words are seemingly easy, English learners don't notice them. Or rather, you don't notice how they're part of a larger chunk of language. And sounding natural English depends on you noticing and learning these collocations. So, here are some other examples of collocations with the verb set that I found using the website Sketch Engine, which is a fantastic website for language teachers and language learners. I will put the link in the show notes. So here are some examples of how there are lots of very common everyday collocations with delexicalized verbs. So we've got, you can set a record, you can set a goal, you can set a limit, you can set a precedent, you can set a target. And these are just a few of the very many examples of collocations containing the verb set. So my tip for you, try this. Choose a text, say one of the articles I've referred to in today's episode, go through all or part of it, maybe just a paragraph, and identify all of the collocations containing delexicalized verbs. That is, get, go, take, make, do, have, give, put, and set. Or you could just identify get, for instance. Just go through a text and identify all of the chunks containing get. You could limit yourself to a single verb. Now, Scott Thornbury, he's the foremost expert on learning English as a foreign language. He speaks at pretty much any international conference for English teachers that I know of. Hugely popular figure. He's a wonderful person, I think. He's done a lot for the profession. He's got a great imagination. He's a great public speaker. Well, he refers to these patterns as word grammar, and he wrote a whole book on them to draw our attention to them. But one of the books that I think has been less popular, I believe it's called Natural Grammar. I've read it, and it's actually not very well known. So if you happen to be a teacher as well as a learner, I highly recommend getting a copy of it. So I just mention this so that you don't just take my word for this idea. Don't take my word for it that these basic collocations with delexicalized verbs are important. Scott, the foremost expert on English language teaching, has pointed out that these basic patterns are basically the backbone of English. So stop focusing so much on grammar and try putting this strategy into practice. There you go. Put something into practice. Put another delexicalized verb. Put something into practice. A common collocation containing a delexicalized verb. Now that I've taught you this, you won't be able to stop noticing them everywhere. Now, let's go over today's vocabulary, which you'll be able to study using my monthly Quizlet flashcard set if you sign up to my newsletter. Keep in mind that the flashcards include sentences with the vocabulary in new contexts to help you learn more effectively. So, in our midst, if something's in your midst, it's a person or thing that is among a group of people, and it's often something dangerous or threatening or unusual. So I decided to call this episode Zombies in Our Midst. It means they are among us, and obviously zombies are not something we necessarily want among us. When I looked for other examples in the dictionary, I came up with an example of spies in our midst, and then another example was poverty in our midst, something unpleasant, maybe unexpected, especially if you're a Tory. Now, disproportionately benefit the most affluent members of society. That's I was talking about the tax cuts by the Conservatives, the Tories. If something disproportionately affects someone, here disproportionately benefits, it affects them much more than other people. Adverbs are very important for advanced learners, and this is a common chunk, to disproportionately benefit, or it could be disproportionately harm, for instance. Now, spook investors. We'll often come across this verb. To spook, it's used, we can also talk about spooking an animal, but in newspapers, for instance, you'll often hear about investors being spooked. It means being frightened, being made nervous by instability, unpredictability. If you drive up the cost of something, it means you make something more expensive, a phrasal verb. Now, undermine something. So I was talking about how these new measures brought in by the new Prime Minister and her Chancellor are undermining the growth they are trying to promote. So if you undermine something, you gradually make it less strong or effective. I talked about the scrapping of bankers' bonuses, or rather the caps on these bonuses. If you scrap something, you get rid of it. You decide not to use a plan or system because it's not practical. Trickle-Down Economics. A belief that additional wealth gained by the richest people in society will have a good economic effect on the lives of everyone, because the rich will put the extra money into businesses, investments, and so on. Trickle. When a liquid flows slowly in drops or in a thin stream, like raindrops down a pane of glass. A herd mentality. When people behave like animals in a herd and stick together without questioning the direction they're going in. Pick up on something. If you pick up on something, you notice it, especially when other people haven't. Now, at one point I said, when I was giving you this tip about noticing delexicalized verbs, I said the following. I said, choose a text, say one of the articles. Now, notice how I used say in a particular way. I used it here to attract attention to what I was about to talk about, namely the articles. I'm drawing your attention to the fact that you don't have to go looking for texts to practice, to put into practice my tip. I've given you reading to do, let's say, as homework. So we use say in this way when we're about to mention an idea, a suggestion, and we want to draw attention to it. And finally, I talked about Scott Thornbury being the foremost expert on English language learning and teaching. If someone's the foremost expert on something, they're the leading expert. That is, the expert with the most authority. So, thank you very much for listening. As I said, I'm really happy to be back for another season. I'd love to hear from you. Let me know if you found the strategy for slaying language learning zombies useful. Tell me about your experiences trying to spot common collocations containing delexicalized verbs. What examples did you come up with? I'm curious to know. So get in touch by sending me an email to sean@ethosenglish.com. Thanks for listening, and see you soon.